If you are still basking in the glow of last Sunday's glorious Easter worship, good news, Easter isn't over. Last Sunday was just day one of the Easter season, a season sometimes called the Great 50 Days. It starts on Easter morning, celebrating resurrection, and ends 50 days later on Pentecost, celebrating the Holy Spirit. And the word Pentecost, in case you weren't aware, literally means 50th. It gets its name by counting days. In worship, now is the season for the church to remember and reflect on the post-resurrection life of the disciples and on the difference that resurrection made for their life of following Jesus. We don't limit ourselves to that brief period. We think broadly about the development of the early church. And our lectionaries direct us to spend time in the book of Acts and in some of the letters to the churches. So as I looked over the text for this whole season, I noticed two things going on in the church. They were experiencing rapid change, and they were experiencing conflict. They were a church in motion, and therefore they were also a church in commotion. Often the two go together, rapid change and conflict. Could it be, just maybe, the church of today could find something to relate to there? In today's readings from Acts 1 and Mark 6, the commotion part of that equation that awaits them is not quite yet obvious. We'll get into more of that in the upcoming Sundays. But these texts set the stage for the conflict that is yet to come. They call for Jesus' followers to be in motion, to be on the move, to not live defensively, but to embrace the power given to them and to go take risks. So let's look first at Acts 1. One thing that strikes me is how daring and difficult this mission seems for a group of traumatized people. These disciples are only days or weeks after Jesus' suffering and violent death, and after the terror and turmoil that overcame them all, that buried them in an avalanche of grief and fear and panic and confusion. Now, yes, Jesus' several unexpected appearances did also instill in them a strange sense of hope. But it was all still so new and so full of mystery and unknowing. It's obvious from the post-Easter gospel accounts of Jesus' appearance to his disciples that the resurrection was kind of a mixed bag. The disciples were both joyful and still full of dread and fear. And then in Acts 1, we have this scene of Jesus' farewell. And here's what he tells them. Go back to Jerusalem and wait, but only for a bit. Soon you will be given more reassurance, and then you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. From the get-go, Jesus tells his followers to stay in motion, to be a pilgrim people, to look for the pain of the world and move toward it. Now, this is not a new idea coming from Jesus only after resurrection. No, other times during his ministry years, he almost literally pushed the disciples into their zone of discomfort, saying, go, do the work of the kingdom. This is not about you or your comfort or your personal preferences. There are broken people and broken systems out there in the world there are people getting pushed to the side and forgotten, go, get close to them, be in the healing business, be in the release from bondage business, be in the compassionate inclusion and restoration business. Because that's all of that is God's business. So make it yours too. Our other text, Mark 6, tells about one of those times early in Jesus' ministry that he told his disciples to go get on the move and do kingdom work. Mark says he gave them authority and sent them out in pairs. Go, free people, heal people, give good news to people. But there's a surprising twist. There's a curious and uncomfortable part 2 of the instructions. I say curious because it sure doesn't sound like the way Jesus' people have typically worked. Over the long history of the church, we've done part 1 quite well. We've been sending people out with power and authority for 2,000 years. We've been sending them everywhere, even into hard and uncomfortable and desperate places. But this second part doesn't sound very familiar, and it doesn't even sound like a great idea. Verse 8, and I quote, Jesus ordered them to take nothing for their journey but a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. He said to them, wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave town. In other words, dear church, go into the world with authority and power, but go with nothing. Be vulnerable. Be entirely dependent on those to whom you are sent. Would you go under those terms? All you have as a resource is this intangible and invisible thing called authority. And even that's not something you can prove that you have. There's no signed certificate, no keys to the city, no special access code. No one even knows you have authority until you can demonstrate it in some convincing way. Instead, the posture you take as you present yourself to the world as a representative of Jesus is a posture of utter neediness, vulnerability, dependency, and with one tunic, almost nakedness. Who does this? Jesus expected his disciples to. And I just have a hunch he still does. No, I'm not being literalist here. It's no sin to pack a suitcase when you travel. But I think what we are asked to do is just as difficult as going somewhere with literally nothing on our backs. We are asked to be vulnerable and exposed while we are stewards of the power of the gospel. Now, you might know that the church, as an institution, doesn't have a very good track record with vulnerability. We build protective structures around ourselves. We strike a pose that asserts power. When we make mistakes, we usually dig in. We protect our assets. We have often packaged the gospel into handy containers so that we can go out to those who need it and distribute it like goodie bags from a position of power, because we have it and they don't. Jesus is preparing his followers to live out the gospel in power and with vulnerability, both at the same time. No, I'm not saying the church or we as individual disciples must divest ourselves of everything we need to survive and start bumming off everybody else, being a parasite instead of providing for ourselves. Jesus' decision in Mark 6 to send out his disciples with nothing in their hands had a specific context and time and purpose. I understand that. That time and purpose and context doesn't exist for us right here and right now. But I do believe within Jesus' instructions was a universal principle that's just as relevant today as it was then. And that is this: know that the gospel has the power to transform the world and transform individual lives. Know that you can be a channel of that power to others, but go toward others with a deep humility, a profound awareness of your own need and your own brokenness. Go toward others knowing that they have something of great value that they can offer you. And put yourself in a position to receive it. Learn to not be self-sufficient. Approach others with an honest curiosity. Desire to know them more deeply and be prepared to love and respect them as they are, not just as you hope they will one day become. When we can pair that kind of power with that kind of vulnerability, I think we will have learned what Jesus was teaching his disciples. And I think that we'll find that others see that character in us and experience it as authenticity and authority. I see far too many Christians today who live life on the defensive, from the local level to the national level. Christians are organizing to assert their power in coercive ways. Dare I say, sometimes even violent ways. Christian nationalism is a dangerous ideological movement being actively promoted by many political and religious figures and leaders to impose Christian authority on a society or on a state. The Jesus I read about in the Gospels must shudder in anger and grief at what has become of his gospel. But you know, it's not just those more extreme examples that we should be concerned about. Defensive Christianity is a temptation for every congregation and every follower of Jesus. I'm often guilty of it, and so are we all. Because we do like having control. We do like holding on to what is ours, to our stuff, to our power, to our position in the community. If the gospel has the power to transform us all, and I believe it does, then Jesus' invitation is to let go of our controlling grasp, to allow the gospel to do its healing and transforming work in us and in all those around us. And to let the gospel's authority speak for itself. We're not doing the gospel any favors by striking a defensive posture. The gospel doesn't need us to validate it or prove its worth. It can stand on its own feet. We only need to be able to notice and then say no whenever we see this defensiveness in ourselves, or whenever we are expected to go along with those who try to co-opt the gospel for personal or institutional or political gain. Because those things are happening all around us. May God give us grace and give us clarity as we are stewards of the power of the gospel, and do so with humility and vulnerability. Join me in our confession that we offer together in the bulletin and on the screens. God, who calls us to be on the move together, forgive us when we stay put. God, who calls us to exercise the compassionate power of the gospel, forgive us when we fail to recognize the gift we have to share. God, who calls us to follow Jesus in humility and vulnerability, forgive us when we build systems that protect and stockpile. The God whose mission is to save, redeem, and heal the world freely forgives us for faltering in our witness and invites us yet again to steward the gospel with confidence and in deep humility. May it be so.